The first time a book sees the light of day is a moment of magic, a fusion of creativity and craftsmanship. But before that moment, there's a journey that begins with a single idea, a spark in the mind of a writer. For John Calvin, this journey was both personal and revolutionary. Calvin's earliest works were born in the bustling intellectual atmosphere of Paris in the early 1530s. He was just a young student then, but his ideas were already stirring. In 1531, he entrusted his first work, a response to the criticisms of Alciatus, to a minor Parisian printer named Girard. Calvin added a dedication, a traditional gesture that showed his commitment to the world of letters. This was a small step, but it was the first of many. The following year, Calvin published his commentary on Seneca's De Clementia with another small Parisian printer, Louis Sineus. This time, Calvin paid for the printing himself and enlisted the help of his friends to promote the book in their university teachings. The edition was even shared with a bookseller from Orléans, Philippe Laure, who took charge of a portion of the print run. Calvin taught Seneca's treatise at the Collège de Four in Paris, and his ambition was clear. He wanted to challenge the great Erasmus, who was at the peak of his career. In 1535, Calvin's life took a dramatic turn. After the affair of the placards in 1534, he fled France and settled in Basel, Switzerland. This move was not just a geographical shift, it was a new beginning in Basel. Calvin found a home with Conrad Retsch and his wife, Catherine Klein, a family with deep ties to the printing world. Retsch, a bookseller who had connections in Paris and Lyon, was one of the first to introduce Lutheran books to France. He even became the godfather of one of Calvin's future printers, Conrad Badius. Basel was a hub of intellectual and religious activity, and Calvin quickly formed connections with a group of printers who would shape his early career. Balthasar Lassius, Thomas Platter, Robert Winter, and Johannes Operinus were the key figures. Platter, a colorful character, wrote vividly about their Colembrate efforts. Calvin's Institutes was ready by August 1535, but it didn't appear in print until March 1536, just in time for the book fair. Operinus, despite the others' names appearing on the title page, did most of the work. He sent Calvin the first copies of another work, Epistolae Duae, on March 25, 1537, promising more and offering other books from his stock. The Institutes and Epistolae Duae were successful, and their sales were strong. Calvin, now in Geneva, had a local printer produce the Confession de Foy, but he remained loyal to his Basel friends for his Latin works. However, he faced printing delays and had to be patient. When he revised the Institutes in Geneva, he sent the manuscript to Robert Winter, who had taken over from the Platter, Lassius's firm. Winter, with Operinus as his advisor, was supposed to handle the project, but he fell behind. Winter missed the 1539 Spring Book Fair and returned the manuscript to Strasbourg, forcing Calvin to find a new printer. In 1545, Calvin tried Robert Winter again, this time with an anonymous pamphlet, the Admonitio Paterna Pauli III. It was a disaster. The work was late, and the copy given to the Basel pastor Myconius was illegible due to dampness. Farel, Calvin's friend, was harsh in his criticism. You should punish the printer who produced the Paul III so badly, yet you had done such good work on this. When Calvin settled in Strasbourg in 1538, he found a new ally in Wendelin Rehel, a scholar who ran one of the largest printing houses in the city. Rehel printed Calvin's revised Institutes, his reply to Cetoleto, and his commentary on the Epistle to the Romans. Even after Calvin returned to Geneva, he continued to send Rehel his Latin works. In a letter to Farel in 1546, Calvin explained his loyalty to Reichel. During my stay in Strasbourg, Wendland bound me to him because of his assistance. When I was in great financial need, he spent more than 40 gold écus on my affairs, and he was as prompt to look after my domestic situation as if I had hired him to do this. Thus it would now be unjust to refuse to send him the epistles. However, the relationship was not without its challenges. In 1546, Calvin's commentary on 2 Corinthians went missing, and a misunderstanding over the Brevis Instructio Adversus Errors Anabaptistarum led to a dedication being omitted without warning. The Schmalkaldic War, which began in 1546, also disrupted the Strasbourg printing scene. Calvin took back his manuscript and had it printed in Geneva in 1548. In Geneva, Calvin found a new supporter in Michel du Bois, who had been one of the delegates sent by the Genevan Council to recall him to the city in 1540. Du Bois, with the help of Antoine du Peignat, tried to become Calvin's preferred printer. Du Peignat wrote to Calvin in 1539, urging him to consider the younger, more efficient printers in Geneva. Du Bois, in particular, was a strong advocate for Calvin's work. This is the story of how John Calvin, a young and ambitious student, became a towering figure in the world of print. Each step of his journey was marked by the relationships he formed and the challenges he overcame. The books he wrote were not just words on paper. They were the products of a complex web of human connections and the tireless efforts of those who brought his ideas to life. Calvin's relationship with the printers of Geneva was a complex one, marked by both collaboration and conflict. The story of this relationship is intertwined with the growth of the Reformation and the challenges of producing books in a time when printing was still a relatively new and challenging craft. When Calvin's second edition of the Institutes of the Christian Religion was published, it caused a stir. Michel du Bois, a prominent French printer, felt particularly disappointed. Du Bois had hoped to be the one to bring Calvin's work to the public, even dedicating his print shop to Calvin. He owned beautiful typefaces, perhaps better than those of German printers, and was known for his meticulous attention to detail. Du Bois's friend, Du Peignat, urged Calvin to support his fellow Frenchmen, appealing to Calvin's patriotism. However, by 1540, Du Bois managed to secure some of Calvin's French works and even a Latin reprint. Unfortunately, the project to print Calvin's Psychopanachia in 1541 failed, and Du Bois suddenly left Geneva, possibly due to financial difficulties. After Du Bois' departure, Calvin turned to Jean Girard, who was the best printer in Geneva at the time. Girard's main competitor, Jean-Michel, used outdated Gothic typefaces, making Girard the natural choice. For nearly a decade, Calvin entrusted his French works to Girard, followed by his Latin polemical writings, and finally his exegetical works in Latin. Despite their long collaboration, the relationship between Calvin and Girard was not always smooth. Girard had a better rapport with other reformers like Viret and Farel, who had initially brought him to Geneva. Girard was a modern printer, using Roman typefaces and introducing modern spelling with accents and diacritical marks. In 1540, Girard published the Sword Bible, a quarto-sized Bible that was more portable and suitable for traveling pastors. However, Calvin disapproved of this version because it was revised without his consent. Girard was known for his high-quality printing, but he struggled financially. He often ran out of funds and relied on financial backers like Jean Chotim and Jean de la Maisonneuve. One of his associates, René de Bienassis, played a significant role in the book trade. Despite his financial troubles, Girard managed to produce many of Calvin's works, including the Supplex Exhortatio, a work intended for Emperor Charles V. In 1547, Calvin's frustrations with Girard began to show. He complained to Viret that Girard had not delivered a preface on time, and suspected that Girard was cutting corners to save money. Calvin's annoyance grew, and in 1550 he wrote to Farel expressing his disappointment with Girard's delays and inefficiency. Calvin's decision to seek new printers, such as Robert Estienne, marked a turning point in their relationship. By 1551, Girard was still publishing Calvin's commentaries, but he no longer received new works. The final straw came when Calvin entrusted the revised version of his commentaries on the New Testament epistles to Robert Estienne. Girard, believing he had the rights to these works, sought a privilege from the Genevan Council. Calvin intervened, arguing that as the author, he should have the right to choose his printers. The council ultimately sided with Calvin, and Girard was left with only the Catechism to print. Calvin's oversight of the publishing world in Geneva gradually shifted to leading booksellers like René de Bienassis and Laurent de Normandie. Bienassis, a wealthy merchant, supported many of Calvin's publications between 1546 and 1554. However, his relationship with Calvin cooled over time, particularly after his support for Jacques de Bourgogne and his friends. Laurent de Normandie, who arrived in Geneva in 1549, became a key figure in Calvin's publishing efforts. He assisted Calvin with the publication of the definitive version of the Institutes in 1559 and continued to support Calvin's works until the Reformer's death. John Crespin, another important printer, set up his press in Geneva in 1548. He published several of Calvin's major works, including the commentaries on the Pauline epistles. However, Crespin was often assigned less profitable polemical works, possibly because he was more adept at marketing them to an international audience. In 1556, a dispute arose when Crespin tried to publish a mid-sized edition of the commentaries on the Pauline epistles. Robert Estienne, who had already taken over the publication of these works from Girard, managed to stop Crespin's print run. Crespin eventually completed the edition in 1563, after the work entered the public domain. By the mid-1550s, the management of Calvin's publications was well organized, with Laurent de Normandie and other printers playing crucial roles. Despite the challenges and conflicts, Calvin's works continued to be published and distributed, contributing to the spread of the Reformation. Laurent de Normandie, a leading financier, didn't run a printing house himself. Instead, he supported Conrad Badius' print shop and worked with other Genevan printing firms, especially Robert Estienne's. From 1553 until his death in 1559, Estienne published the Latin versions of all of Calvin's commentaries and the definitive version of the Institutes. He also printed two of Calvin's polemical works in 1554 and 1555. However, after a while, these types of works were mostly left to Crespin. From 1553 to 1554, the French versions of Calvin's new commentaries were made by Girard. Starting in 1555, Conrad Badius, who was funded by Normandie, began printing most of the French translations of Calvin's works. After Robert Estienne died in 1559, Badius started printing more of Calvin's new works. By this time, Calvin wasn't writing many new commentaries. When Badius left Geneva in 1562, Normandie turned to smaller printers like Michel Blachier and Jean Bonnefoy. Later, François Perrin became Normandie's preferred printer and was chosen to print Calvin's commentaries on Joshua in both Latin and French in 1564. Normandie and his partner, Philibert Grain, worked hard to protect their publishing rights. They had conflicts with other printers, like when Girard tried to print Calvin's works in 1554. Calvin supported Estienne and Jean Chautemps in these disputes. In 1557, Normandy and Grain asked for a monopoly on all of Calvin's New Testament commentaries in both Latin and French. When this privilege was about to expire in 1560, Normandy asked for an extension, but others like Estienne, Anastase, and Jean Bonnefoy still printed Calvin's works. This led to a complaint from Theodore Beza about the poor quality of their printing, which might have been a hidden attack on their competition. In 1562, Anastase was even jailed for his mistakes. During the last years of Calvin's life, Antoine Calvin, John Calvin's brother, became more involved in publishing. He helped with the final version of the Institutes, published in Latin by Robert Estienne in 1559 and in French by Jean Crespin in 1560. Antoine Calvin acted as a technical editor and marketing director, funding the press and ensuring the works were sold. He also oversaw the publication of Emmanuel Tremellius's Inarrationes in Joseum in 1562. In the following years, Calvin finished his commentary on the Pentateuch, publishing it in Latin in 1563 and in French the next year. The Latin text was given to Henri Estienne, Robert's son, but Henry didn't do a great job. Antoine Calvin had to ask the council to make Henry print the first sheet correctly, and even got permission to use another printer for the indexes if needed. John Calvin complained about the many errors in this edition, so for the French version, Antoine turned to Henry's brother, François Estienne. Calvin's sermons were also recorded and published. From 1549, stenographers were paid to take notes of his sermons, and the Bourse Française held the rights. When sermons were printed, the Bourse asked for a fair royalty. In 1554, some of the sermons taken by Regonier started to be published by Jean Girard. Conrad Badius took over in 1557 and published some of the best collections of Calvin's sermons until 1562. After Badius left, Normandy continued publishing sermons with Pinarel and Perrin, who relied on his support. However, Normandy's monopoly was challenged in 1560, when independent printers started publishing sermons. Pierre, Jugglier, John Dumont, and Antoine Cercia published sermons in 1560 and 1561. In 1562, a group of 6 small printers published a collection of sermons. Antoine Vincent, a leading bookseller, also began publishing sermons in 1561 and 1563. Calvin's exegetical lectures were recorded and published with help from Nicolas de Gallards, Jean Boude, and Charles de Jonvillers. Jonvillers was very particular about the quality of the texts and often had to switch printers. The lectures on Hosea were published by Badius in Latin and French in 1557, with a long list of corrections. Crespin did most of the printing for the minor prophets, and the French versions were handled by Nicolas Barbier and Thomas Courteau. When conflicts arose, Jonvillers appealed to the Genevan Council. For the lectures on Daniel, Jonvillers chose Jean de Léon, a protégé of Antoine Vincent. The work had many errors, leading to another long list of corrections. The French version was also printed by Jean de Léon, and Vincent presented the work to the Genevan Council. Jonvillers returned to Crespin for the lectures on Jeremiah. He covered all the costs and sold the 1,300 copies to Laurent de Normandie, Antoine Vincent, and Nicolas Barbier. The French translation, published after Calvin's death, was done by Claude Senetin, a Lyon printer, who also had to produce a long list of corrections. Calvin's congregations were less frequently recorded, but those that were preserved show a similar publication strategy to the sermons. As Calvin became successful, he chose high-quality printers who were loyal to his friends. He delegated authority to his advisors, but still intervened in conflicts. Calvin preferred luxury printers like Robert Estienne, who produced large, well-printed books, even though they were expensive to produce and sell. Calvin's growing reputation allowed him to make demands, knowing his works would sell well. Calvin's dedications also show his changing status. His early dedications were to friends and colleagues, but as his reputation grew, he dedicated works to important figures like kings and princes. These dedications were a way to thank people for their support and to encourage them to protect the Reformed faith. Calvin published over 100 works, but only about a third included dedicatory letters. These letters were most common in his major works, like the Institutes, biblical commentaries, and exegetical lectures. His didactic and polemical works rarely had dedications, and his sermons, which he was reluctant to publish, never did. Calvin's first dedication appeared in Nicolas Duchemann's Anthropologia, where he wrote to his friend François de Conon to help resolve a conflict. His next dedication was in his 1532 edition of Seneca, addressed to Claude de Hangest, a childhood friend and fellow student. These early dedications show how Calvin's circle was initially very small and close-knit. Calvin, the famous reformer, often dedicated his works to different people. These dedications were like special letters he wrote to show gratitude or to connect with important figures of his time. Let's explore who these people were and why Calvin chose them. One of Calvin's earliest dedications was to a friend he called amicus quaedam, which means a certain friend. This dedication was written in 1534, but only appeared in print in 1542. Some people think Calvin made up this friend to make his work seem more important. Others believe the friend was real, but Calvin couldn't mention his name in 1542 for some reason. The second idea seems more likely because it matches Calvin's usual behavior. In 1535, Calvin wrote a famous dedication to King Francis I of France. This dedication was included in his book, The Institutes. Calvin didn't actually send the book to the king or ask him if it was okay. Instead, he wrote it for the readers to see. This dedication was a smart move because it drew attention to Calvin's work. People started talking about it, calling it the Catechism of a Frenchman, addressed to the King of France. The dedication was even printed separately, showing how important it was. Calvin also dedicated works to his teachers. In 1539, he wrote a dedication to Simon Grynaeus, who helped him understand the Bible. Grynaeus was a great teacher, and Calvin used him as a trusted authority. In 1546, Calvin dedicated a Bible commentary to Melchior Woolmer, and in 1550 to Mathurin Cordier. These dedications were a way to thank his early teachers, who had helped him become a famous writer. In 1543, Calvin dedicated a book to Philip Melanchthon, a well-known German reformer. This dedication showed that Calvin and Melanchthon had a close relationship. In 1546, Calvin dedicated another book to Jacques de Bourgogne, a nobleman who joined the Reformation. However, a disagreement later caused Calvin to remove Jacques' name from future editions. In 1549, Calvin dedicated a work to his friends Guillaume Farel and Pierre Viret, who were also reformers. This dedication showed the strong bond between them. In 1550, Calvin wrote a dedication to his doctor, Benoit Textor, to thank him for taking care of Calvin's wife. Laurent de Normandie, a man who helped the Reformation, received a dedication from Calvin in 1549. Calvin also dedicated a work to an Italian nobleman, Galazzo Caracciolo. In 1556, Calvin's dedications to rulers started in 1548. He wrote to kings and princes who supported the Reformation. For example, he dedicated a book to the Count of Montbéliard, who was also the Duke of Württemberg. Calvin's friend Pierre Toussaint helped him with his dedication and made sure the prince received the book. In 1553, Calvin dedicated his commentary on the Gospel of John to the City Council of Geneva. This was a way to show his support for the city, which was facing conflicts. In 1555, he wrote a dedication to the magistrates of Frankfurt, who were friendly to the Reformation. Calvin also dedicated works to groups of pastors. For example, he wrote a dedication to the pastors of Neuchâtel in 1544, and to the pastors of East Friesland in 1545. These dedications were meant to help the Reformation in those areas. In 1561, Calvin wrote a special dedication to all the faithful servants of God in France. This dedication was written during a time when the Reformation was facing challenges in France. Calvin explained his work and his goals in this dedication. When Calvin chose a dedicate, he often had a specific reason. Sometimes his friends suggested names like when the Duke of Somerset recommended the King of Poland. Other times, Calvin sought approval from the person or their entourage before writing the dedication. For example, the pastors of Neuchâtel even made corrections to the dedication Calvin wrote for them. Calvin's dedications were a way to connect with important people and to promote the Reformation. Whether he was thanking a teacher, supporting a friend, or reaching out to a ruler, Calvin's dedications were always meaningful and strategic. Calvin, a prominent figure during the Reformation, often wrote dedications for his works. These dedications weren't just formalities, they served important purposes. Sometimes, Calvin had to rely on people he didn't know well to get information about the people he was dedicating his books to. For example, when he dedicated a book to the King of Sweden, Gustav I, he got the request from a Frenchman living in Sweden named Denis Bure. Calvin didn't even know Bure's name, but Bure accurately told Calvin that the heir to the Swedish throne was interested in the Reformed faith. So Calvin wrote a dedication that showed he understood the local situation. Another time, Calvin dedicated a book to the Polish king and sought advice from a man named Florian Rawitz Szeliga. Szeliga turned out to be a fraud who disappeared in April 1552. So Calvin removed all references to him in later editions of the book. When Calvin dedicated a book to the Elector Palatine, he asked for advice, but didn't wait for a response. Some of his friends thought this was a bad idea because it might upset the Lutherans. Calvin defended himself by saying he had asked for advice in good time, but didn't get a reply. This dedication was particularly puzzling because a counselor had told Calvin 4 years earlier that the timing wasn't right. Calvin often relied on friends and intermediaries to deliver his books. For example, Pierre Toussaint presented Calvin's work to the Duke of Württemberg, and Nicolas de la Fontaine, Calvin's secretary, presented books to the young King Edward VI in England. When Calvin dedicated a book to the sons of the Duke of Saxony, a Genevan bookseller took the books to the Leipzig Fair. For the commentary dedicated to the Council of Frankfurt, Calvin's colleague, Jean de Saint-André, brought the book to Frankfurt. When Calvin dedicated a book to the Queen of England, he sent a new messenger from Geneva to London. For the dedication to Prince Radziwill, Calvin sent the book to Frankfurt and asked Peter de Thennis to make sure it reached Poland. The most detailed information we have is about the route the books took from Geneva to Sweden, going through Emden. Dedications in the 16th century had 3 main functions. First, they built a connection between the author and the recipient, often to gain support or sponsorship. Second, they served as a preface, giving readers an idea of what the book was about. Third, they allowed the author to comment on current events. Calvin's dedications did all of these things. He used them to express appreciation, explain the content of his books, and discuss important issues of the time. For private dedications, Calvin's main goal was to show his gratitude and friendship. He often mentioned personal connections, like his discussions with Grenadius, his health issues with his wife, and his close friendships with Farel and Viret. Even though Calvin didn't seek financial rewards, he wasn't offended when he received gifts. For example, he noted that the wife of the Duke of Somerset had sent him a simple ring worth about 4 crowns. Public dedications to kings, princes, and magistrates had more complex goals. Calvin followed the example of Erasmus, who sought to build relationships with high-ranking figures to promote academic studies and piety. Calvin was aware that many of these rulers knew little about him, so he often used recommendations from people in their circles. He wrote very flattering letters, creating idealized portraits of the recipients. For example, he encouraged Edward VI to continue the work of the Reformation. Saying that God was calling him to do so sometimes, Calvin had specific goals. In 1553, he asked the Genevan Council to continue helping religious exiles. In 1555, he asked the magistrates of Frankfurt to do the same. He also asked Queen Elizabeth to welcome exiles from the previous reign, and he tried to address negative perceptions about women rulers. Calvin hoped that dedicating his books to famous people would give his works more publicity. He wanted his books to reach specific audiences, like the Reformed in Neuchâtel or the subjects of the King of Sweden. Many of the recipients were meant to be models for others to follow, like Jacques de Bourgogne for religious faith, the Duke of Württemberg for moderation, and Gustav of Sweden for equanimity. Calvin often explained why he chose a particular recipient. Sometimes, the choice was based on the theme of the book. For example, he dedicated the commentary on 1 Corinthians to Jacques de Bourgogne because the themes were similar. Other times, he admitted that the choice was random, and he was simply offering his latest work. Calvin also used dedications to provide information about his books. For example, the dedication to the Duke of Somerset explained why the book was suitable for him. The dedication to the Commentary on Romans situates the commentary within the context of his institutes. Many dedications contained attacks on the Roman Catholic Church and its supporters. The letter to Francis I defended French evangelicals, and the dedication to Edward VI criticized the Council of Trent. Calvin's dedication to the Elector Palatine summarized the controversy over the Lord's Supper between Calvinists and Lutherans. The dedication to Prince Radziwill attacked the ideas of Stancaro and Biandrata. Some of Calvin's dedications were very successful. The one to the Duke of Somerset was well received, and Viret encouraged Calvin to continue. The dedications to the kings of Poland and England were also successful. However, the dedication to Queen Elizabeth didn't change her reservations about Calvinism. Some of Calvin's choices were ill-timed, like the dedication to the Elector Palatine, and he sometimes changed the dedicates in later editions. For example, he replaced the name of Duke Christopher of Württemberg with that of the future Henri IV, and he removed the name of Szeliga the Swindler from the dedication to the Polish king. Calvin followed a careful process when it came to dedicating his works. He started by dedicating his writings to private individuals, hoping they would help spread his ideas. As his reputation grew, He began dedicating his works to more prominent figures like princes and kings to gain their support. Sometimes he chose these dedicates based on requests from others, even if he didn't know them well. Other times he was unsure about who to choose and sought advice. For example, he wrote to his friend Farel, asking for help in finding the right person to dedicate his commentary on Genesis. When dedicating his works, Calvin tried to strike a balance. He wanted to flatter his dedicates to gain their support, but he also wanted to stay true to his principles. He was not as overly flattering as many of his contemporaries, but he still used kind words to express his hopes and admiration. For instance, when he had to remove someone's name from a dedication, he expressed his regret and disappointment, showing that he valued the integrity of his work. Calvin was also very involved in the publishing process. He understood the technical aspects of printing and often provided detailed instructions to printers. For example, he preferred the deluxe editions prepared by Robert Estienne over the simpler ones by Jean Girard. He paid attention to the size of the fonts and the width of the margins, ensuring that his works looked both attractive and readable. Calvin also cared about the physical appearance of his books. He worked with printers to choose the right fonts and paper quality, especially for important works like the Excuse de Jacques de Bourgogne, which was addressed to Emperor Charles V. He even discussed the placement of the dedicate's motto and family crest, showing his attention to detail. When it came to proofreading, Calvin was not always perfect. He sometimes rushed the process, leading to errors in his works. For instance, he criticized a 1543 reprint of the New Testament for containing major errors, even though he had revised it. He later admitted that the translation was still better than previous versions, but stressed the importance of careful proofreading. Despite his imperfections, Calvin's involvement in the publishing process shows his commitment to ensuring his works were well received and widely disseminated. He worked closely with printers and booksellers, providing advice and directives to ensure the quality and accuracy of his publications. His efforts helped spread his ideas and solidify his reputation as a leading figure in the Reformation. Calvin faced a big problem when it came to printing his works. In 1551, during a famous church meeting, a man named Balzac criticized a part of Calvin's translation of Proverbs in the French version of the Institutes. This criticism was picked up by some of Calvin's enemies, and things got worse in 1555. John Lange was accused of slandering Calvin before the Bern Council. Lange admitted to making statements based on a passage from one of Calvin's books. The council noted that Calvin had said the mistake in the book was the printer's fault, not his. However, the tribunal decided that Calvin, as the author, should have corrected the error before the book was printed. They thought Calvin's excuses were not good enough. The mistake in question was a small typo. Instead of inique, which means wicked, the word iniquire was printed. This small error changed the meaning, making it seem like God was the author of evil. This typo first appeared in the 1541 French edition of the Institutes and reappeared in 1545. Calvin was upset about this and sent a written protest to the Bern Council. He argued that the error was clearly the printer's fault and that even children could correct it by reading the surrounding text. He also complained to his friend Bullinger, saying that he was being unfairly blamed for something that was clearly a printing mistake. Despite his protests, Calvin's opponents remembered the Bern Council's condemnation and used it against him. Calvin's habit of blaming printers for mistakes suggests that he often stayed away from the final stages of publishing his works. This changed later in his life, when he had more time to focus on writing. He noticed many errors in the Latin edition of his commentary on the Pentateuch and was especially concerned when his brother Antoine and Henri Estienne had a dispute over publishing rights. Calvin wasn't as careful as his friend Beza when it came to reviewing printed works. Beza was very particular about accuracy and gave detailed instructions for proofreading. Calvin, on the other hand, was more relaxed about these matters. His early education had left him used to old-fashioned spelling, and he didn't pay much attention to modern spelling rules. This influenced the way his works were printed, leading to a return to traditional spelling in Geneva around 1550. Punctuation in Calvin's works is also a topic of debate. Some scholars believe that the original punctuation should be preserved, while others think it should be modernized for clarity. It's likely that the printers, rather than Calvin, were responsible for much of the punctuation in his works. The timing of book publications was crucial for booksellers, especially for the Frankfurt fairs. These fairs were major events where publishers from all over Europe gathered to sell their books. Calvin was well aware of the importance of these fairs and often adjusted his publication schedules to meet the deadlines. For example, he delayed the publication of the Institutes in 1538 because the printer was slow, and he rushed to finish his response to Albert Pachias in 1542 to meet the next fair. The dates of dedications in Calvin's works often give clues about the actual writing and printing process. Many dedications were dated close to the completion of the print run, suggesting that Calvin wrote them just before the books went to press. Sometimes the dates were symbolic, like when he dated a dedication to his birthday, even though the book was printed later. Overall, Calvin's relationship with the printing process was complex. He faced challenges with errors and deadlines, but also adapted to the demands of the publishing industry to ensure his works reached a wide audience. John Calvin, the famous reformer, had a complex relationship with money and business. Unlike Saint Francis of Assisi, who rejected material wealth, Calvin understood that money was necessary for life and could be used for good. He aimed to use money wisely without becoming a slave to it. Calvin was in regular contact with financiers and merchants through his brother and associates, but he managed to stay above the fray, maintaining his integrity. Calvin's early experiences with printing showed him the financial side of the business. In 1532, he paid for the printing of his commentary on Seneca's De Clementia, which cost more than he expected. Before becoming well known in Geneva, Calvin faced financial struggles. He received help from Wendelin Reichel, a printer in Strasbourg, who spent a significant amount of money to assist Calvin, especially for the 1539 reprint of the Institutes of the Christian Religion. One instance where Calvin's financial concerns became clear was with the publication of Excusez-moi, les Nicédimistes. Calvin provided detailed financial reports to the sponsor, explaining costs like engraving and printing. He was transparent about the expenses, even noting small details like the cost of meals for the engraver. In 1552, Francisco de Enzinas sought Calvin's advice on publishing a Spanish Bible with illustrations. Calvin discussed the project with several friends, but found that most were hesitant due to the high costs and uncertain sales. Despite Calvin's enthusiasm for spreading the Bible in different languages, the project didn't materialize, partly because Enzinas died of the plague. Calvin also played a role in the publication of propaganda materials. For example, he helped arrange the German translation of a pamphlet about the religious conflict in France. The work was successful, with over 1,000 copies sold in Frankfurt. Calvin's involvement in book production often involved sending parts of works to friends before they were complete. This was a common practice in the 16th century, allowing authors to share their work and get feedback. Calvin sometimes sent incomplete copies to his correspondents, preferring to keep them informed rather than wait for the entire work to be finished. When it came to advertising, Calvin didn't directly control how his works were promoted. Publishers like Wendelin, Rahel, and Jean Girard often added flattering remarks to the title pages, sometimes without Calvin's input. For instance, Rahel included a glowing endorsement by Jean Sturm on the title page of the Institutes. Calvin seemed to find these efforts somewhat amusing, but did not always approve of them. Jean Crespin, another of Calvin's publishers, sometimes took liberties with the titles and claims about his works. In 1560, Crespin got into trouble for publishing a composite edition of Calvin's commentary on the Acts of the Apostles, claiming it was revised when it wasn't. This led to Crespin's arrest and a requirement to recall the faulty copies. Overall, Calvin's approach to money and business was practical and principled. He recognized the importance of financial matters, but remained focused on his religious and reformist goals. His interactions with the printing world and his publishers show a man who was deeply involved in the practical aspects of spreading his ideas while maintaining his integrity and dedication to his faith,